Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Tissue-Based Research Workflows virtual event. Our first presentation for today is Tissue Processing, a cornerstone to quality downstream testing presented by Robin Fitzl. My name is Serena, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want during the presentation. To ask a question, click on the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. Type your questions and hit submit. The speaker will answer your questions following the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, please click on the Q&A box to let us know that you're experiencing a problem. Please join me by welcoming Robin. For a complete biography on our speaker, visit the Biography tab on the left. Robin, over to you.
Thank you for joining this Leica Symposium on tissue processing, embedding, and microtomy, the cornerstone to quality downstream testing. In this presentation, we will cover the following objectives: pre-analytics, steps to ensure molecular integrity; fixation, steps that are required to ensure morphological and biomarkers integrity; prosection, which involves prepping and sampling for good processing; and tissue processing, reconsidering loading and leaving. We'll cover embedding, tips to make sectioning easier, and microtomy, techniques to ensure that you have beautiful sections. At the end, we will have a short period of time for questions and answers. First of all, let's look at the workflow overview that's involved with tissue processing. First step is arterial or vascular ligation, collection, then transport, reception, prepping, processing, sectioning, formalin fixed paraffin-embedded sections, and molecular methods. I have taken a few of these items and color-coded them to break them into sections that we can talk about more in detail. On this slide, we will discuss in detail pre-analytics involving warm and cold ischemia. Warm and cold ischemia are more accurately applied to transplant specimens, but for this presentation relates to the time of ligation to collection as warm ischemia, and cold ischemia defined in this presentation as the time from collection to fixative. When we talk about warm ischemia, the factor that impacts the tissue quality are several items. The most important in the warm ischemia field is the time to fixation. You'll see below that it is requested that tissue be placed in fixation within a 20-minute window. The quicker the better, because as stress responses are initiated almost immediately after the tissue is deprived of its blood supply. If you need to, keeping tissues near 4 degrees Celsius prior to fixation will slow down some of these processes induced by oxygen and nutrient deprivation. Prior to fixation, tissues should be maintained in a neutral isotonic solution with physiologic calcium and magnesium concentrations to avoid unnecessary disruption of adhesion systems and activation of signaling cascades. So an example of that would be PBS plus the calcium and magnesium. The other factors that impact tissue quality include temperature of the fixative, type of fixative, volume, total time in the fixative, and the size of the tissue sample. And as I mentioned before, we've already touched on the time to fixation and the temperature. Let's move on to the next slide, talk about the type of fixative. So we've already talked about the time we need to get the specimen to fixation and maybe even a temperature we need to keep it at. Let's talk a little bit about the type of fixation. Most common in the laboratory is neutral buffered formalin and or formaldehyde. There is a lot of discussion around these two items and what is one better over the other, but a lot of the literature indicates and websites indicate that they're basically the same. The only caveat is I did see that some commercial options with MBF is that they might contain a small amount of methanol, which might impact some of the testing. When it comes to the volume of fixation needed, usually the general rule is 10 to 20 times the size of your tissue. That can be quite a challenge for large organs, but for most of what's seen in life science arena, a small container, 4 ounce, 8 ounce, 16, is usually doable. With that being said, it is important that if you are removing whole organs, that you do want to prep those organs so that the fixative and subsequent reagents you're going to see in tissue processing have access to not only the exterior but the interior, especially items such as kidneys, lungs, and heart. For those tissues that are whole, or especially if we're going to be processing rat brain, perfusion is ideal also for cardiac samples too. So after you've prepped your specimen, whether it's bisecting the kidney or even piercing the serosa of some organs, such as kidney, uteri, maybe even liver, even those organs that maybe have a pseudo-serosa, such as prostate, we definitely want to make some type of incision so the fixative can get access if it's a whole organ. After that, for small specimens that have been sectioned, you want 12 to 18 hours for small biopsies, 24 to 72 hours for standard tissue. It is critical because formalin, although it penetrates rapidly, it fixes very slowly. And the whole goal, especially when we talk about molecular methods, is that RNA degrades very quickly, and as soon as the formalin can get to that tissue and make those methylene bridges, the better preserved you will see for molecular testing, and especially for IHC. When we're prepping those samples to be processed in our tissue processor, it is important that we realize that we have to cut sections that will fit into the cassettes for adequate processing. We usually suggest sections less than 5 millimeters thick, or usually in the laboratories I'm used to working in, we asked residents or PAs to cut tissues thinner than a nickel and the size of a postage stamp. That is because tissue cassettes are limited in their size by 3 centimeters by 2.5 usually, unless you're using mega cassettes. You want to allow for 5 millimeters of space around each side of that tissue sample. It's also very critical that you select the right cassette. Usually for routine processing, you'll see the cassette at the top is most commonly used. But for smaller samples, especially for vessels, small biopsies, small skin sections, the cassettes down below with smaller pores are usually ideal so that the sample is not lost. Why does it matter when we're cutting our samples to be processed in those tissue cassettes? As you can see here from this section in the cassette, automatically you can see that it fits very tightly at the top and the bottom, not allowing maybe for the fluids to be able to agitate through. If this tissue is too thick, you're going to see that the interior of the specimen as you cut into it on paraffin is not going to section as well, or maybe under processed. Also too, if the section is too large, it may not fit on the glass slide when you cut your sections. So there's other items here too that you can run into when the section is not thinner than a nickel or the size of a postage stamp, or even not even placed in the correct cassette. So at this point, we are ready to begin our tissue processing. Processing of tissue consists of three basic steps: moving through alcohol to remove your free water, moving through xylene to remove the alcohols and get ready for paraffin, and then the paraffin step, which certainly removes the remainder of any xylene that's residual, and then you're ready for embedding. So after the specimen is loaded into the processor, sometimes it will go through another step of formalin fixation. But the major first step is to remove the free water, not bound water, and usually you will see 2 to 3 graded alcohols and then usually 3 absolutes. This is a gradual removal of the free water where it's a delicate balance of removing the free water but not over dehydrating the tissue. The next step, of course, is xylene that removes the alcohol, and usually, traditionally, we see in laboratories 3 xylene stations. It is advised that you have a small amount of heat on the last station before paraffin so that there's a nice transmission of one reagent to the next, being that paraffin is a solid at room temperature. The last step in processing, of course, is then displacing that xylene with paraffin. I've seen a lot of literature and am seeing in life science laboratories where temperature is being taken more into account based on the testing that's done in the laboratory. Traditionally, we had temperature on every step of tissue processing. It was can I say, necessary evil to make sure that tissue was processed, because in the day we would rather have tissue a little over-processed than under-processed for sectioning. H&E and IHC was more forgiving for most of that, but as we move more to a molecular testing in the histology laboratory, it is critical to pay attention to the temperatures. I am seeing more low-temp paraffins also being used. Please remember that it is very common to see pressure and vacuum used on every step in a processor, which is fine, but on the paraffin step, it is strongly recommended that you only use vacuum because the PV, which is a push and pull in the retort, is actually, it might be pushing that little bit of xylene that's residual in the tissue back and forth instead of actually pulling it out. If there is a small amount left in the tissue, you will certainly see that at H&E, which will give you a hazy, more poorly defined morphology. Have a little snapshot of the type of protocols that you might normally see in a laboratory. This is very common. You'll see that there's 3 graded alcohols, just 2 absolutes, 3 xylenes and 3 paraffins, which is very common in the laboratory. This slide doesn't include those temperatures or PV, but I did want to point out that it is becoming more and more common because of the molecular testing to customize protocols for tissue size, sometimes even for tissue type, especially for fatty specimens, if anybody is using those in their testing. One thing that we have been traditionally practicing in the histology laboratory is that we would take total time and just divide everything up among the steps, as you can see. But I see that more and more labs are actually taking more thought into the times they want to set, where they're heavy on the front end of using 70% and lighter on the absolute because they're trying not to remove that bound water. The processing, the tissue coming out of the processors is actually easier to cut. The IHC and some of the molecular methods are more accurate because they are taking time to really delve into and customize the protocols for the tissues they're using and the testing that they want to do. One item that's sometimes overlooked due to the busyness of the lab is maintenance. I will tell you there are many artifacts that you will see on your H&E, on your IHC, that will go back to the root cause of maintenance on the processor. I have, as you see here, I put that exhausted reagents make for exhausting reworks because it will require either reprocessing of the tissue or taking another sample because the tissues can't recover what damage has been done. It is very difficult to remove residual xylene once it's in the tissue, to get it out, to go back. Usually another sample has to be taken. That ends the section when we talk about collection of samples, placing them in fixative long enough, making sure the sections are good, and then processing them. We're going to move on to some information about embedding. Embedding is pretty straightforward. There are some tips and tricks that are helpful. One thing to be mindful of, and I mentioned this previous, is that I see more life science people in the laboratory taking temperature into account, especially with molecular testing. Low temp paraffin is usually the option of choice. There are tools that we're going to talk about. And one little note I made at the bottom, and I'll explain this a little bit later, is that this is not a slow cooker for your tissue. So let's talk about embedding medium. Please be sure that we talked about the type of paraffin that's needed for your laboratory. Follow the temperature recommendations on whatever paraffin you may purchase. Please remember that this is not a slow cooker. I have been in laboratories where tissue cassettes were taking off the processor, placed on the embedder, and either had intentions of embedding within an hour or so, and had an account where the cassettes had actually been in the embedder for a couple of weeks. This is a critical note, as not only will your IHC be compromised, especially nuclear markers, P53, Ki67, HER2. It's really critical to make sure that they're embedded within a reasonable amount of time and not kept on the embedder. Also, the heat will degrade your RNA. Embedding tools are important. As we know, there's a plethora of molds available, whether you would choose metal or plastic. They create the consistency what they need. I personally prefer metal, as it seems to, I've worked in clinical laboratories, it makes it a little quicker to pop those molds out. Also, too, my tool of choice are forceps that are curved so that the ends of the forceps do not create any punctures in the tissue. As I will, it transfers to the slide. I'm wondering why there are holes in my tissue, but allows you to press firmly on the tissue without creating any artificial appearance. Also, too, is very popular are tampers. They're just square pieces of metal, usually aluminum, and with a handle attached. You'll see the slide at the bottom right that allows you to keep the tissue on an even plane. This is critical, especially if you have more than one piece of tissue in the mold. You want to make sure that everything's on the same plane when you're getting ready to cut, so that you don't have to sacrifice one portion of your sample to actually get to another part of that block. Okay. In embedding the tissue, there are so many ways to embed tissue, and everyone has their favorite methods that work for them because there's so many different tissue types, so many ways to embed. But a few tips I list here is that, making sure that tubular tissue such as vessels are always embedded on end so that you can view the lumen. For samples that we mentioned earlier before, curettings that have multiple pieces, want to make sure those are kind of toward the middle and all kept on the same plane by using that tamper. With long tissue, diagonal's always been great. Whether you put your block in horizontally or vertical, diagonally embedded tissue seems to take the impact off of the blade when you're going to section and keeps the compression down. For membranes, it's always good if you can use a applicator stick and wrap that membrane around there and then place it in the middle and keeps it toward the center and able to keep it in this central location. With skin, one thing I've found to be helpful is that a lot of times skin has depending on where it's coming from, of course, thick dermis or subcutaneous tissue attached. And so we would always embed those diagonally. And I actually liked putting the skin down facing the blade so that I wouldn't be coming up from the sub-Q, which sometimes would cause the skin to separate at the epithelium. So that's one trick that might help with sectioning, especially with skin that can be a little difficult at times. Embedding tips. These blocks are great examples of how you want to keep a 3mm border of wax around the perimeter. The only one I can see is at the 9 o'clock position where looks like some of that subcutaneous tissue touches the edge of that mold. This gives you the stability and the support you need with the tissue when you're taking those sections. Always want to make sure when you're finishing up your embedding and putting those cassettes on top, try not to capture any air bubbles. Avoid underfilling because if you can get to the top of that cassette, it gives you even more support. If it is underfilled, you risk the chance, especially with tissue that can be dense like bone, uteri, of actually popping off because it doesn't have that support on the backside. I've seen scientists sometimes take blocks and always in a hurry, but just happen to take a rack of or a tray of blocks and throw them in the freezer, thinking that would certainly help move things along a lot quicker. And when they were pulled out, they were cooled too quickly and just had a lot of cracks that actually ended up in the tissue and gives you that artifact on your slide of cracked tissue. It's on the opposite side of that. It's not good to let those blocks just solidify at room temperature. You definitely need your chill plate on or have an ice tray out that you can use. Of course, I've done this being in a hurry. We try to get our molds out quickly so that we can go ahead and section and get done. But premature mold popping certainly sometimes will leave some of the tissue behind in the mold if it's not ready. Moving on to microtomy. The first thing I'd like to talk about with microtomy is the chuck holder. Make sure it's clean and tight. Usually they're very simple, as you can see in the image at the top, or a little bit more complex on the bottom right. Want to be sure that once you have it set to a zero plane, want to just set it and forget it. There's nothing worse than sitting down trying to cut tissue that is inevitably, it's always the case that it is a small tissue, and having the plane change where you might have the risk of losing that tissue when you begin to section. So once it's set at zero on either plane, you just want to set it and forget it. With either chuck holder, you will see at the bottom when you pull the lever forward to put your block in, there are two springs at the bottom. And we've already talked about how we keep the blocks cold, and some people use ice trays. Well, that brings in an element of moisture, and so that moisture can collect at the bottom of that little groove where the block sits. So it's always important to dry that off at the end of your cutting session and lubricate it with a couple of drops of oil so that you won't have problems down the road. Also important is that you'll know that when you put that block in its chuck holder in the corners where the block is kept firm, paraffin can build up in those corners and actually change your plane too. There are a ton of different blades out in histology, and there's a lot of conversation and controversy about which blades are better. You can use high profile or low profile, and it really just depends what works for you. Most holders, blade assemblies actually are equipped now that they can hold either one. As we discussed with the chuck holder, some of the items we'll repeat because it's important with the blade assembly as well. Everything you see on this blade assembly to the right, you'll see there are three handles, one for the blade, one for the assembly that will move the blade holder back and forth, and then one for the angle. Want to make sure that all of these are kept free of paraffin and lubricated according to manufacturer recommendations. You will see on the side of the blade assembly, there's always a setting for the angle. Based on the design of the blade assembly, you will see an angle that needs to be set anywhere from 3 to 4 degrees. I have seen them go beyond that or under that based on the design of the blade assembly. Why is that important? It's because you have to have the right clearance angle to properly section your blocks. You can see here on this diagram that if it's not set correctly, you can get a variety of artifactual cutting, whether it's vibration, Venetian blinds, or actually the blade biting into the tissue and you losing part of your sample. Some of the tips I offer when people are cutting on a microtome is to make sure that the sides of your blocks are clean. That extra piece of paraffin, like we discussed before, can get trapped in the chuck holder, or it can eventually, when you're cutting and not keeping the back of that blade clean, you'll see a paraffin buildup that will keep you from getting ideal sections because it won't ribbon properly. Let's talk about some of the things you might see in the laboratory that would be helpful. Keeping the blocks cold is important. You can see here from the block and the ribbon that came off of it, if it's not chilled properly, you'll get compression, and even more so beyond that, if you keep cutting, you'll see where the section's not cutting evenly and you'll have holes in the section, as you can see in the bottom right-hand image. More problems, especially if the blades aren't changed very often, you will see compression of the tissue, as you can see on the water bath to the right, top right, and the section on the left that came off of that. If the blade or the angle is not correct, here's an example of Venetian blinds. Some of the tips too I've suggested is using a dull straight edge to take off the sides of your block, because sometimes a fresh sharp edge of the block will help with the ribboning. If you have blocks that consist of tissue that tends to be on the drier side, such as pig skin, especially blood, sometimes a trick is just to dip it in a little bit of chilled water for a few seconds, put it back on the microtome, and then take sections right off the top. Once you get your ribbon, then we're going to place it on the water bath to be able to pick it up. Let's talk a little bit about that. I know the water bath is boring, but it's critical to the quality we're looking for. Temperature is especially critical because if it's not hot enough, the section won't be able to flatten out and lose all those wrinkles. Then if it's too high, then it can cause the section actually to break apart, and we don't want that either. You can see at the bottom here, the water bath is a little too warm and the section is starting to separate. Under H&E, you can actually see that separation. With water baths too, I wanted to make sure I mentioned that if you are doing molecular testing, it might be important to use ultra pure water. I think it's called DEPC water, which some of you are probably already familiar with too. If you are doing molecular testing, especially with RNA, it's probably wise to use RNase to clean everything up around your instrument and on the water bath so not to contaminate it. I promised you a histology hack, and there's a ton of them out in the field, but I'll bring you this one when it comes to sectioning. If your sections, and sometimes this happens with tissue that's just dense, you just can't seem to get a good ribbon, And every section you take, you've chilled it, you've moistened it, you've got your temperature at the right temp in the water bath, and you still just can't get that ribbon. As you can see, this one on the upper left is full of wrinkles. Take a beaker or a glass dish and make up a really weak solution of absolute, right? Maybe around 40 to 50%. We can't use charged slides on this, but you can pick up the final product with a charged slide. Make your ribbon and then lay those few sections on that alcohol bath. Then take a non-charged slide, which are usually just the basic cheap slides, right? Pick up that ribbon and then gently place it on your water bath. You will be amazed at how that section will gently spread out and usually get rid of all the wrinkles so that it's ready to be picked up with your charged slide or or slides that are designed for IHC. One thing about slides after they are picked up out of the water bath, I think that some of us don't think about is whether we put these right away in the oven or, if we're going to leave them out at room temp. Because the goal is, whether you do either one, depending on if you're doing molecular, we want to remove all the water that's behind that section that's on the slide, right? With charged slides, it's a little bit more of a challenge because it's charged to hold the section, but it also tends to hold water. So every time you pick up that section, you want to make sure that you set it upright on a paper towel or something that will cause it to drain well. Be careful with charged slides. If you pick up a section and it didn't position right, or if you got a little crease in it and you want to lay it back out, with charged slides you can't double dip in the water bath. You might just need to cut another section. Also, too, with these slides that are designed for IHC, they are not only charged, but they're also designed that sometimes they're hydrophilic, so it's tough to try to reposition or pull that section off. You may just have to cut another section. So, with the goal being in mind of just trying to get that water out from behind the section in more conventional settings, if you're not doing molecular, sometimes you could leave slides out overnight and that would work just as well. In a molecular setting, we have to be more cognizant of RNA degradation and then for antigenicity when it comes to IHC also. So I've been told that recommendations are usually a low temp oven around 60 degrees Celsius for about anywhere from 40 to 60 minutes. You can see here's a couple of examples of things you'll see if water is trapped. The upper right-hand side, there's a water droplet that got trapped, and you can see it's quite evident once you stain it with H&E. On the left, the same issue happened with residual water. The morphology in this area, too, will be hazy and poorly defined sometimes, especially if they put the slides in a high heat oven. This is just a repeat of the oven tips that we don't want it too cold or too hot, just right, because although H&E is for the most part forgiving, you still will see artifacts if it is too hot or too cold. If the water has not been removed, or actually you boiled what little bit of water was behind that section. We certainly see it with IHC. You also see, like I mentioned before, the loss of cellular detail, and no doubt you'll lose the quality that you want to see with some of your molecular methods. There has been literature out there that talks about sectioning tissue for IHC not too far in advance, as if the sections are taken and not stored properly, even in clinical settings, they used to do it where it would set at room temperature, for a few days until they did it. And we're seeing that even at that short amount of time, you see loss of antigenicity. I think especially in a lab that is doing a lot of molecular testing, that would want sections that are cut right away. There is a recent article out that talks about if the sections do need to be cut, then coating them with paraffin will preserve that RNA and IHC targets. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. We'll now open up for questions and answers.
Well, thank you so much, Robin, for that informative presentation. Just a quick reminder to our audience on how to submit questions. Simply type them into the Q&A box and click the send button. We will answer as many questions as we have time for. And the first question is, why is there such a short time to preserve the specimen once it is removed?
Thank you for that question. I'd also like to include, if I can, before I answer, that I believe that my contact information was not included. If the participants would like to reach out, it is Robin, ROBIN Fitzl, FITZL, at LeicaBiosystems.com. So to answer the question that you asked, if there are those out there in the field that are measuring phosphorylated proteins related to cell signaling in tumor tissue, once tissue is procured, the phosphoproteins fluctuate rapidly. And so that is why it is ideal to move the tissue into some type of fixative or fast freeze it within that 20-minute window. It's related, if you're doing individualization of molecular targeted kinase inhibitor therapies. And so that's why I maybe should have added additional information that if you're not doing that type of research, that the tissue needs to move into fixative within at least an hour.
Fantastic. And the second question we have here, can you explain some differences using silane and silane substitutes in the lab?
Sure, you bet. Xylene, of course, those that are familiar with it, brings into the laboratory its own level of hazards. A lot of people have decided to move to a xylene substitute or even to isopropyl processing. The thing that distinguishes xylene substitutes is that it is an aliphatic, so that there's features to it that it doesn't infiltrate as well as xylene. So that we usually, what we see is that people extend their protocols in the clearing by about 20%. Also, too, I believe, according to some recommendations, it's suggested that you change it more often than you do with xylene.
Fantastic. And it looks like this is our last question coming in. It says, why is it important for sections to be less than 5 millimeter at embedding?
Oh, good question. Tissue should normally cut anywhere from 4 to 5 microns, depending on the tissue, of course. With lymphatic tissue, lymph nodes, it's a higher cell density, so we usually cut those around 3 microns. On the opposite end of the spectrum, usually brain tissue is cut at higher, anywhere from 8 to 10 microns. It's all about the density of cell. So if you're using light, you want the light to be able to pass through so you can certainly read it.
Great. And if it's okay with you, we do have a few more coming in.
Sure, absolutely.
One of these says, how long can you leave samples in embedding center before loss of tissue quality?
There's nothing written in stone about that. Usually, and I've actually reached out in the field to see what the consensus was, and most felt like it would be ideal if it can be an embedding center less than 45 minutes to an hour. If you are concerned about, depending on what your target of research is, the next alternative was that it's totally fine once you take it out of the processor and it's been paraffin infiltrated to leave it on the counter at room temperature. That would certainly ensure that those targets are protected. And then once you're ready to embed, you could just move those to the embedding center, let the paraffin melt, and then you can begin. Because you certainly don't want to embed your tissue where the paraffin has solidified into your mold, because you'll get a separation.
Great. Okay, and we have one coming in from Alexandra. It says, how would you handle fresh tissues without PFS fixation for the embedding?
I'm thinking maybe they're asking the question that if the tissue's fresh, you're doing cryotomy, maybe you're freezing it. So I'm not sure exactly. I don't think you can do fresh tissue in paraffin that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Maybe some clarification would help.
Well,
we could do another question if there's
another one. Okay, great.
Uh-huh.
Let's see. Any particular tip for cutting mouse or rat bones, considering they're well decalcified? Angles for cutting or water temperature suggestions?
Sure. Certainly, kudos that they are well decalcified. I think that's the number one issue we usually run into is tissue's usually not. By the time you get it processed, you get all the way down, you're running into difficulties. Certainly, if it's long, I would do it at an angle, taking that impact off the blade. Water temperature still, I think I forgot to mention water temperature in the presentation that it's anywhere from around 39 to 41 Celsius. So that you get an ability for it doesn't to break apart, but you're able to stretch out. And the little alcohol trick might actually help with those type of specimens.
Great. And it looks like Alexandra tried to clarify with the question.
Yeah.
So the question was, how would you handle fresh tissues? And they said that the fresh tissue for cytosectioning.
Oh, that's what I wondered. Yeah. It's pretty much the same technique as paraffin. If you can do long tissue at an angle to take the impact off the blade, keep it near the center. You certainly want to have enough cryomedia to surround, give you a nice border, just like with paraffin, because it's all about supporting that tissue when you're cutting it. And if it has a lumen, certainly you want to put it on end. If it is a sample where you need to see multiple layers, you want to see it. You want to put it on edge, just like with skin, right? So I hope that might help. And certainly feel free to email me if I can we can expand on that.
Well, fantastic. Thank you again, Robin, for that very informative presentation.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And thank you also to our audience for joining us today and for all their interesting questions. And again, we will address any questions we didn't have time for today and those submitted during our on-demand period via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. This session webcast will also be available for on-demand after the event. So thank you all, and that's it for now.
Thank you.